What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Brandon, back with another edition of the Macro Insights podcast. But first, before we get started, a little disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor, and the guest is not giving financial advice. So everything you hear on this podcast is strictly opinion and should not be taken as financial advice. We disclose if we have any holdings discussed in this podcast, and you should not be following us as financial advisors. You should discuss this with professionals before you get involved or invested. And as always, it's not financial advice. So please take this strictly as our opinions and for entertainment purposes only. Now let's get into the show. What's up, everybody? I'm back with another edition of the Macro Insights podcast. But first, I'd like to thank my sponsor, Inverse. Inverse is a social collaborative investment research platform. So many new companies like Robinhood and others have increased access to financial markets, but Inverse is increasing the access to high quality investment research and discussion. The entire platform is built around top-notch data and tools that allows you to analyze over 10,000 stocks and ETFs seamlessly, embedded all into one platform. And in the coming weeks, you'll be able to link your brokerage account and share your portfolio to maximize that credibility when you're talking about the various stocks and ETFs that you're writing about or criticizing, what have you. And you can also have access to their portfolio analytics tools. I myself have been using the Inverse platform for quite some time now, and I absolutely love it. I get on there and I share my podcasts, newsletters, and what have you, write about various stocks, ETFs, what's going on in the macro. I do all that in the Green Candle Investments group, so be sure to join that group and discuss and post a little bit in there with me as well. But now, let's get into the show. I got a very special guest. If you've been following me for a while, you know Joey from the Bitcoin side of things. But now I have my friend, my pal, Joey Tweets at Joey Tweets with an extra E. Joey, how you doing today? Uh-oh.
I'm doing really well. Thanks for inviting me on. I know it's like short notice. We're like grinding out the content here over at GCI. And I'm giving up my lunch hour to talk about just the insanity going on south of the border here. Lots to talk about today, buddy. Happy to be on.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So I appreciate you coming on in short notice. I had a very special guest that's going to come on next week that had to push it back because he's not feeling up to a pod right now. So like I said, appreciate you coming on, but we're going to talk a little bit about different stuff than we do normally, because normally, like I said, we talk a little bit about the Bitcoin stuff, but we're going to dive into the macro as there's a ton to get into. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about like your background as far as like stocks, macro, because I mean, everybody knows a little bit about your Bitcoin side of things, but what about the other side, like more of the financial TradFi kind of stuff?
Dude, I wish I was like formally educated in TradFi and economics, just so I would have, the other side of the equation from what the Bitcoin space gives you. And the Bitcoin space is a great place to learn. Of course, don't get me wrong. You and I both know that. So do many of your listeners and followers. But, I think about the environment we're in now, and I wish I had known a lot of this stuff before I started my own investing journey back in 2016, 15, something like that. When I first started investing, all I thought about was weed stocks and number go up. I had no idea how to read a balance sheet, no idea how to look for quality information, use a trading view chart, use Twitter for important information disclosures or discerning what's what as far as earnings reports and things like that. But now that I'm a little older, I've met obviously you guys over there in the States, and we got a little private chat going as well. And there's a number of other FinTwit Bitcoiners that come from the TradFi space who I think provide a lot of valuable advice. They may not agree with everything I think as a Bitcoin guy, but I think there's some value in understanding each other's point of view. And, no doubt, Brandon, there's a lot of people who I think try and silo themselves because it makes them feel better. But if you're not being disagreed with, you're not getting anywhere. So I can't disagree with that sort of point of view, that stance enough. I'd be curious to hear what your investing background is, to be honest with you, because this is my first Macro Insights appearance. And I know you're a Bitcoin guy, but I don't know your investing background actually either. So what is yours?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I got into it a little bit, I think, like on one of the earlier on ones. But basically, like I started off. I have an engineering background, so biomedical undergrad, mechanical master's degree. And during my master's degree, I was like, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do, to be quite honest. But I knew like, all right, I'm going to start making money soon, so I need to figure out what to do with it. And that's when I started listening to podcasts, and I was driving Uber to make enough money to go out to the bars one night a week. So I started with an app called Acorns. I don't use that anymore, but for anybody just getting started, I think like one of these, robo advisors might be a good place to kind of start, just to get, money started to get invested. And so what that does is essentially and I think at that time too, it was free for college students, but usually they charge like a minuscule fee. They just put your money into like general S&P index funds. And they can let you do like certain things, like you spend 95 cents, they round up to $1 and they invest that 5 cents. So something along those lines. So I started doing a little bit of research, just getting into it. From there, listening to a couple podcasts. I think one of them was called like the Millennial Investing. I don't really listen to that one, but she was like a financial advisor. And then the We Study Billionaires podcast with Preston Pysh and Stig. So that was before Preston kind of went all in on Bitcoin and everything like that. But that one's a little bit more advanced for sure, like especially when you're getting started. But the more you listen to it, the more you kind of like understand some of these things and get a little curious about other topics. So I started listening to them, and that's when I kind of got interested into Bitcoin and like the greater macro environment. And then I just kind of got curious into that. And so, yeah, I mean, just doing my own personal research, like figuring out ways to grow my own wealth was the end goal of, just doing all this research. And then, I started telling Dan, who was my former co-host, about
Disgraced former co-host.
Yeah, exactly. I started telling him and a bunch of my other buddies, like, hey, like, you guys need to figure out what to do with your money too, because like, we're all going to start making money pretty soon. And Dan was like the only one that really listened to me. So I was like, well, Dan, I think there's other people out there that want to absorb this information. Like, I don't think I'm just like this one crazy off-end person. Like, I think there's probably some other people out there too. So that's kind of like why I started Green Candle Investments and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, like similar to you, it's all pretty self-taught. But, I think the one awesome thing about putting out content in this space is like you get access to so many great financial minds and everything like that. So, I mean, I've been lucky enough to hear, guys come on my spaces Tuesday nights and other places and interact with FinTwit people that, come on my spaces, then go to CNBC the next day and say almost exactly what they're saying, there. And then, I get to ask questions and do all that kind of stuff there as well. Where opposed they're just kind of reading off a script on TV. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, all kind of self-taught, but started off with like kind of like the general just robo advisor trying to figure it all out. But I mean, like, as I've kind of gotten in, like you said, I started around the same time as you, 2016, 17. And now it seems like it's gotten even crazier. Like everything I think I kind of learned the first 3-4 years.
You find out every day that you don't know something you thought you knew.
Exactly. And especially in the environment, that came with 2020, crazy inflation, all that kind of stuff. I think, you just learn like, all right, maybe all the principles you learned and all this stuff you kind of like dumbed it down, maybe don't apply always, and the market is pretty unpredictable. So on that note, like, how do you view like the overall current macro environment? Just give me like an overarching umbrella. We got huge CPI prints, we got energy crisis on the foot, we got a ton of inflation. Like, just give me your overall general sentiment and like how you're feeling going forward.
I think if I could describe it in one word, I would say fragile. It's probably more fragile than it's been in our lifetimes for sure. I'm a little older than you, but not much. And, I think even our parents, talking about interest rates in the 80s, for example, up at 10%, 11%, and more in some parts of the world. I think even they view this as a fragile environment where, we're going through an economic contraction in most of the modern world at probably the worst time as far as demographics. We've never had more entitlements and more people looking to cash in on those entitlements for longer periods of time, thanks to the increase in life expectancy, for example. than we have now. And we can talk about some of the European energy stuff, Germany specifically, something like 30x what you would have expected to pay for your monthly energy bill this time last year, and the futures looking even more steep as far as the cost to the average household. Canada's budget office today did a review of the current government's sort of budget projection for next year and years coming. And that office, which is nonpartisan, predicts that the government at this rate won't be able to balance its budget until 2041 or something like that. So, I mean, I think about that. I think about what you guys are doing in the States, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, the debt forgiveness, among other things. And obviously Jackson Hole is this weekend as well. I mean, I think that if I was someone who had no money in the market, I'd feel fine. If I was someone who had, what's an average allocation for someone's liquid net worth into equities, for example? I know for me, it's a significant amount. I don't feel great about it, but I also don't feel bad about it. I think if you had all your money in the market, you probably wouldn't feel that bad about it either, especially if you're around our age, let's say between 25 and 45. It's very much unpredictable at the moment. And, on top of that, we should be talking about things like the Taiwan-China tension, like the BRICS countries getting together, like the SPR being drained, like the unrest at election time in the United States. That's the sort of pillar of democracy on the planet, or it is so alleged by you and your countrymen there. And so I think about all these things, and I think fragile is probably the best way to describe what you're seeing right now.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Right. And I think it's kind of interesting because, I had, I do the Tuesday night Twitter spaces, and I had Nancy Davis on there the other week. And she came up and said that, in all other FinTwit spaces, they're kind of seeing this recent bump up, and they're like, oh, now it's deflationary, that we've kind of seen it peak, and everything's going to start coming down. The Fed's going to keep raising rates, and essentially we've already seen the peak inflation. But I mean, to me, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about it as well, is I see just the things that you're listing out, right? Like extreme energy crisis, like over in countries like Germany comes to mind, where they're, moving away from the quote unquote ESG and green energy and burning a lot of coal in order to heat homes in the winter. You're seeing that. You're seeing a potential China-Taiwan conflict. I mean, it's essentially any day now, when China decides to invade Taiwan. And, we've already had kind of that chip shortage, and, companies like Taiwan Semiconductors come to mind there, where, they're the biggest supplier for companies like Apple. So, I mean, that could also increase inflation in electronics and other things like that as well. And yeah, I mean, it seemed like the only space that I guess was going on in that talking about it is kind of maybe people who aren't as I guess educated in the macro, that are kind of seeing these things go on and kind of seeing kind of thinking that inflation is not just over and it hasn't peaked yet. So do you think that I mean, I guess that the educational background kind of has people believing maybe that that inflation has peaked, whereas the average person, the average Joe like me and you, are just who are kind of learning this stuff as we go, are kind of wait, this doesn't make sense. Do you think that kind of gives us maybe an advantage, or do you think that maybe we're missing something here, and that these people are all got it figured out?
I think both sides are probably missing part of the picture. In our case, right? Sort of I think you and me, if we picture in our heads a spectrum of investing chops, right? At the top end here, you'd have guys like Mike Green, Eric Townsend, et cetera, who are really seasoned investors, and not just seasoned, successful investors. So they've been around a long time and they've had a lot of big wins. Then somewhere in the middle, you have the people who've been around a long time and don't have as many big wins, but they're at least experienced. And then somewhere between the middle and the bottom, where beginners are guys like you and me, where we've been around, like we said, I've been investing 6 years now, not even a decade of managing my own money. And I think that there's a group of people like us who see things in a way that maybe the guys on the top end don't. And it's sort of reminiscent of that bell curve meme, right? With the Jedi on one end and the sort of brainlit Wojak on the other. I think that for us, when we get on Twitter spaces, podcasts like yours or mine, and we talk about what we're seeing in inflation, for example, we're living inflation we're living through this inflationary regime in a different way than someone at the top end of that spectrum, someone with money, for example, someone who works for a place where jobs are never in danger, for example. And our experience is different for that reason, but it's also different because we think about our balance sheet, our monthly balance sheet a lot more. I think about what I'm spending my money on every month. I think about what my wife is spending her money on every month. I consider my mortgage payment. Like, I'm on a variable rate, for example, in Canada, and a lot of my peers are as well. So I think about all these things a little more. When I see, whether it's my government, your government, or any other first world government, making proclamations about how well things are going, I can see in my day-to-day life that that's not the case. I can see that my gas is much more expensive. I can see that I am more hesitant to take long trips. I can see that when I go to the store, bacon is on sale for $10 where it used to cost $7 on a regular, on a regular day at the store. I can see all these things. I think the people at the top end of the spectrum see things that you and I don't see. They see things like bond markets, long duration bonds showing weakness. That oftentimes is a signal that economies are nearing treacherous waters. I think they also see things like, futures and options flow, for example, that indicates that the market is moving a certain direction. I think people look at Jerome Powell's statements and I think that, at the beginning of COVID, for example, Brandon, like, how many people do you know that knew about the Burr meme and knew about the money printer? Very few, but I think now everyone knows about it. And so that's become kind of a contra indicator, I think, for people at the top of the food chain, that retail and the sort of, everyone below the top tier of investors is going to be looking at this and taking it at face, or constantly referring to the Burr meme, when maybe these people at the top view this as, a more legitimate policy move or policy statement. I'm looking right now at Bostich and Harker and all these other guys at Jackson Hole from the last, 3 or 4 hours. And the market's responding to this stuff in a way that tells me that it's not just going to be money print or go Burr, that a lot of people with a lot of money and the people who have the most skin in the game think that this is going to go again in a direction that is detrimental to equities markets, detrimental to the average investor, detrimental to, investors of all stripes, really. And so there's something in between those two that we all benefit from, especially if you're on financial Twitter, where you get to see both sides. And obviously, the Green Candle Spaces on Tuesday night is a great place to get this kind of shared view, this kind of cooperation between the two parties. Now, I'd be curious to know what you think about what you're seeing in your spaces, because, like you said, you run a Twitter space that gets 1,000 people a night some of these nights, and you get a lot of big names there. Have you noticed a shift in narrative between 2 days ago, 3 days ago, and maybe 7 or 8 weeks ago, let's say 2 Fed meetings or 3 Fed meetings ago? What have you seen as far as sort of sentiment around the market?
Yeah, and I think, like, I get some differing views. Like, I mean, it's almost like a cop-out answer, but I get some differing views there, for sure. So, but I think the commonality that I hear is like, well, the Fed, their only basically lever that they can pull is raising interest rates at this point, because they already did the damage of printing all this money. And that's the only way that the Fed can essentially combat inflation. But on the flip side, is it really just like a strictly monetary policy inflation? And that's where, a lot of financial Twitter kind of has that disconnect. Some believe that it is like, all right, they can pull this lever and it's going to work. But, a lot just see it as like more of like a supply side issue, like kind of like the issues that I was saying before. You got energy crisis, like all that kind of stuff. I think of guys like Doomberg coming in and saying, these kind of things. And it's like, okay, well, if the Fed doesn't raise interest rates, we're still going to have very high inflation. But, asset prices are going to kind of keep rising, whether that's the stock market or real estate or other things like that. And so essentially, like, they need these asset prices to kind of go down so there's less access to money. But on the flip note, like that less access to money is going to hurt a lot of these companies coming in, needing access to money to get goods.
Capital markets and R&D, especially early stage R&D, early stage startups, need Yeah, they need easy money to succeed, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, what this is going to do is essentially just put the U.S. in a recession. Now, a lot of people, I see like a disconnect too, where they kind of talk about the job market, where they think that the job markets are still, thriving and everything like that. And just anecdotally, I personally kind of went through this a job switch recently, and finding a job was not as easy as everybody sounds like. Granted, I'm not in an entry level position, but that seemed like basically where everybody was hiring. And it seems like you said, like a lot of these people who have a lot of money, they don't really feel the effects of inflation that maybe you or I do, or maybe many of our listeners do as well. And so I think that their disconnect is not as evident as maybe Powell or the White House press secretary, who comes up there and says the crazy things that she says. But I think not only financial Twitter, but other people are kind of starting to wake up to the fact, like, hey, like, inflation's running crazy, like, why did this happen? And they're getting more curious. I know I saw like Unusual Whales, so shout out to him. He runs Great Spaces, an account too, but he tweeted out, I believe it was like somewhere between 50 and 60% of Americans believe that stopping doing student loan repayment on their debt, student loan like forgiveness, I'm sorry, on their debt is going to increase inflation. And so, I see like a lot of people just in my fiat mining job that they were ecstatic that this happened. But at the end of the day, a lot of these student loans were federally backed, and the government's going to find out how to get their money some way, shape, or form. And so I think that there's still like the financial Twitter is aware of that fact, of that canceling student loans and stuff like that overall probably wouldn't be good long term for the economy. But like I see other people kind of come up too that are kind of like excited that fact is happening.
Well, yeah,
And
I mean, is it fair to say that the same people who think that it's a good idea are the ones who couldn't figure out how to make the student loan payments on time, couldn't figure out how to manage their finances? Like, this is sort of a general sign of financial illiteracy, in my view. What do you think?
yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that as well. I think, at the end of the day, it's just a big financial literacy issue, like not only in the United States, but probably globally. And I think like, more people are figuring that out just because everything is tightening around them. And I think it's out of necessity at this point. And it's kind of, discouraging to see all that. But, it is kind of, I think like at the end of the day, some people aren't going to wake up to it, because like we're seeing this conveniently timed policy right before midterm elections here in the States, where Biden is giving this forgiveness. So for those who haven't seen, it's if you're making less than 125K a year, you get $10,000 off your student loans. And if you received a Pell Grant, I'm not quite sure the qualifications for a Pell Grant, but you get $20,000 off your student loans. And so, that's billions of dollars that the federal government loaned out, and now all of a sudden are just going to poof, gone, thin air. Like
This
I don't really,
disappears, man.
yeah,
Disappears. And I heard a good stat on Commentary Magazine's podcast yesterday. Christine Rosen, who is a columnist for Commentary, pointed out that, if you think about the way debt affects the most people and the way the White House is sort of painting this as a way to support poor people and minorities, as if somehow they should be grouped together at every turn. She pointed out that the average wage in America is about $31,000. Do you know what the average wage of the people who just had 10,000 or 20,000 in debt forgiven was?
now how much?
74. So, if you're talking about really helping people who need it, it's a horseshit metric. They know that the people who are getting that debt forgiveness are the ones they've kind of lost, who've lost faith in them over the last 2 years. And presumably the ones who are just in a position where they have enough as far as home ownership, investing, whatever, to notice that inflation is giving them a hard time. And so they're trying to buy back that vote leading into November. It's truly treacherous. And I'll just also note, I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm not an American, but I'll also note that, there's a lot of people who say, well, why didn't I have my debt forgiven? And the answer is, why are you against debt forgiveness? Why does it matter to you if you paid your debt? We should be forgiving other people's debts. I would posit to you and to people listening and watching that it's not about the people who've already had their debt forgiven or paid off. What about the people who take debt next year? Are they taking it, and should they be expecting a jubilee like you got? Because now these people who are part of the jubilee class truly become the privileged of next year, next 5 years, next 10 years, right? Well, you were able to get out of your debt because Biden forgave you as part of an election campaign, and I didn't get that same thing. And so next time, when the next set of kids is running around Times Square yelling "Eat the rich," they're going to be talking about these $10,000 of these people who got $10,000 forgiveness. It's lost on them. I'll make one other point. Political, maybe, but I think we should. I'm going to say it here. You don't have to respond. The Republicans are mishandling this because the answer to debt forgiveness like this is not to say, well, we should forgive debt for people who need a truck for their work. We shouldn't be telling these people who need a truck for their work that they have to get an electric car to, make sure they're better on gas and they're paying less for fuel. We can't tell people that can't afford their hydro bill. Well, just get solar panels and it'll be fine. Can't tell people that shit. What they should be saying, instead of saying we need to forgive other debts, they should be completely averse to this kind of practice, because what you're seeing now is Republicans doing the work of the Democrats for them. We cannot go down a road where you get, then I get, then you get more, then I get more, then you get more, then I get more, because eventually you're going to have a debt jubilee in totality. And when that happens, I mean, you're absolving people from their moral obligations, their ethical obligations, and really, from like a pragmatic point of view, you can't be an adult if this is something you need to get by. If you couldn't make a good decision at 18, this is another bullshit thing I don't buy. People are going into universities not knowing what kind of degrees they're going to get. You may not have known at 18 or 19 when you got there, but certainly by 21, you started to think about this. And if you didn't, that's really your problem. You can vote, drink, join the military, all those things. If you can't make that decision for yourself, then you shouldn't be allowed to vote either. You shouldn't be allowed to smoke or drink, or I would argue other things, other privileges should be revoked too, but that's an opinion that might be too harsh for this show. I just think it's really dangerous to talk about which debts are worthy of forgiveness compared to others. It's a game you don't want to be playing in a modern democracy.
Well, I mean, on that note too, like you're saying like debt being forgiveness, but I feel like there's a deeper underlying story too, where it's like essentially people are just getting used to, especially the past couple of years, the government just coming to their rescue and giving them handouts. And
that's
so,
you and me too, by the way,
yeah.
with interest rates dropping and free money, like everyone assumes everything's just going to be okay, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. So it's not only that, like interest rates were at all-time lows. We had, stimulus checks where, obviously they printed a bunch of money, but, people got just for living, got like checks of like $1,400-$1,500, like, or what, 2 or 3 of them. And, obviously it wasn't enough to sustain over that long period of time if you lost your job or anything like that. But, people were vouching for those. And, I think at that time, if you were against stimulus checks, you were kind of like an asshole, right? I mean, like people were like looking at you like, why don't you want to help all these people? Thinking that this $1,400 or $1,500 or what, or $1,200, whatever it was, is going to help people, a family of 4 or whatever through an entire month. And like, I don't know about you, but my expenses, whether it was rent and all that at that time, like that wouldn't even cover like any of it. So, I mean, it seems like it's all kind of just like a farce at this point, like, just covering the underlying issue. And like you said, just kind of almost like buying votes. And I don't think like either party is like really playing it correctly at this point, to be honest. But do you think that there's kind of like an underlying issue now where it's been a couple years now, and it seems like, all right, every 2 years, 4 years, whatever, people are going to start anticipating some of these handouts, and they're going to start, becoming more dependent on the government as things go on. So do you think like that's kind of the slippery slope that we're on, or do you think, there maybe is some light at the end of the tunnel where somebody's going to come in and kind of change these policies and not necessarily give all these handouts?
Well, I'll tell you that this may look like a coffee cup, but I was actually drinking milk in here, and I'm glad I was, because that, my friend, is a spicy take. That there's going to be a 2-year, 4-year cycle of, insane forgiveness mechanisms for people who just made mistakes over the last 2 or 3 years. I don't think you're wrong, and I also would just say that some are more obvious than others. What we're seeing here is kind of a mask off moment for politics. I think there's vote vying in every election. Entitlements are one way to do this. we can talk about in Canada, we have this thing called the baby bonus that goes up every time there's an election, or healthcare, there's more money put into healthcare, or now you get free dental in Ontario, up here, that's what we're talking about now. There's all manner of ways to buy votes. I think to your point about the expectation, that's the important thing. People now are going to look at this and say, hey, these guys literally gave away, I think it's like $800 billion or something like that. Was that the number of the debt relief? Something of that nature. I think it's about, as far as I understand it, it's about it's about 80 million Americans at about 10,000 each, which I think is about $800 million. Okay. So you have this huge swath of people who have all manner of debts. There's nothing wrong with being in debt. Like, everyone carries a bit of debt. I know I carry a bit of debt. I'm sure you do. I'm sure, people do. I don't view these people as irresponsible, but if these people start voting in a way that disregards other policies because they just can't put food on the table, for example, or can't make ends meet with rent or mortgage, for example, or they have another child and the kid needs food or clothing or shelter or whatever, and they turn their backs on things that would normally be part of an election campaign, social issues, or, domestic defense or military spending, or, Roe v. Wade, great example, right? If people are voting only for the party that will give them the most money in their pocket, that's a bad thing for democracy. And it used to be that you at least had to be smart enough to be able to discern through policy positions and through speaking engagements, things like that, whether there was going to be money coming to you or not. Now you don't even have to be that smart, which is another problem. They're really lowering the bar for being able to interpret what's coming in an election. And I would be shocked, Brandon, if in 2024, the debt jubilee thing for students is not a huge election issue, because if inflation continues to run hot, 6% plus, 7% plus for another year, I mean, how could it not be, right? Everyone's going to be thinking about this stuff. And you can see in the minutes from Jackson Hole that at least two of the Fed governors don't think the fuel relief is going to stick around. At least two of the Fed governors think there's going to be a 75-point hike. And I saw today that it looks like Huawei, which is, I guess, one of the biggest companies on the planet, certainly one of the most influential, is telling their staff that it's going to be a downturn like no one has ever seen before. They're preparing for survival. I mean, come on. If you think all this stuff is at least partially true, even, it's a whirlwind. And I would argue that politicians used to care about not throwing gas on the fire because they cared about the direction the country was going in, broadly speaking. Now, I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, exactly like you said, like it seems like it could be maybe a slippery slope, and it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in like the next couple of years. And, you brought up Jackson Hole, and I think that's kind of an interesting point here because, we're talking about debt forgiveness. So, right, 10,000 per, American that has student loan debt. So a bunch of money being just vanished, right? And so that obviously is going to cause inflation, but then they're going to hike rates. It's like they do one thing that's trying to combat inflation, and then doing another thing that's basically making inflation even worse. And so, like like Powell has a very tough position, and as much as like people give him grief and everything like that, it's like at this point, like, what can you really do to kind of pull the levers? Like, maybe he should have acted earlier. Like, everybody can kind of play Monday morning quarterback and go back and say, all these different things. Like, he didn't act quick enough. He should have raised earlier, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, like you said, it seems like to me that we're at a place where we can see a very, very bloody recession and maybe even like a depression. And so it could be to a point where like they're handing out money, but they're trying to combat it. So like, how do you see all this stuff kind of playing out in like this Fed Jackson Hole meeting? Like, people are kind of at the edge of the seat, like listening to Powell's every word, dissecting it. I know you and I are kind of following, just not strictly just because of content, but I'm genuinely interested in like what's going to go on and like how the market's going to react with all this stuff. So I mean, on that note, like, how do you think like every single Fed meeting, like people are going to be hanging at the edge of this guy's word? And at this point, it seems like Powell has almost an insane amount of power where he can essentially say one thing and the market's going to go in either direction.
Yeah, I think that's probably true and will continue to be true. I'll note that Jeff Gunlock often says that if you don't feel like watching Jerome Powell and the Fed meeting minutes and all that other FOMC kind of, gong show, you can just look at the 2-year rate and see where the 2-year rate's going. And the Fed trails that usually by about a month or 2 months. So I haven't looked at the 2-year rate this week, but generally it's going up. And so I would expect another raise. I'll also note that the Fed's job is harder now than it was 5 years ago for one other reason. And that's because of the retail exposure to stocks that just didn't exist 5 years ago. You and me, when we were investing early on, I would never have known about FOMC meetings, about, quantitative tightening, quantitative easing, the interest rate mechanism and lever. All those things are, they're foreign to a new investor, unfortunately, or at least they were. Now, thanks to Twitter, and because most of us have at least one friend who's obsessed with this stuff, you're getting people into the space for the first time and giving them, kind of a pamphlet. Here's where to look, here's what to look at, and here's who to follow. And part of that now is, unfortunately, Jerome Powell. And he's, I think, finding, or at least the Federal Reserve, I think, is probably finding that the general malaise from most Americans that they're used to is disappeared, and it is never going to return because people are managing their own money now. No one I know buys mutual funds. They all buy their own ETFs. You're doing that. I'm doing that. I think that the other problem, as far as where this is going, I really don't know. But I would say that I don't know because this is not my thought, although I do think this as well. It's not only me that thinks this. I'm sure many people think this. I don't think we've ever had this many moving pieces that have significant, tangible potential inputs on where the global economy goes next. And I don't think that the Overton window for what comes next, as far as system changes, has ever been so wide. There's definitely a lot of people who think that, the Great Reset agenda is something to be concerned about. I don't know I don't know a lot about that, but it's on my radar for sure. A lot of smart people I listen to, Macro Voices and Market Huddle. Those are great podcasts with a lot of really smart people, well-known, world-renowned investors. And I hear Great Reset now more than I ever have before. I hear Debt Jubilee more than I ever have before. I hear BRICS more than I ever have before. I hear US dollar hegemony falling apart more than I've ever heard before. I hear Belt and Road, things like that. If you start going down these rabbit holes, you will find that it is impossible for the average person to, make heads or tails, to draw a map from point A to, this sort of unknown point B. That's either, I don't know, is it 6 months, 12 months, 18 months away? Who fucking knows? But I think the best thing you can do is just be agile as an investor and not be married to any thesis, because all it takes is one zero hedge headline to turn everything on its head these days.
Yeah, exactly. And, you brought up an interesting point about retail getting invested. And I know you're kind of limited on time with your lunch break. So this will be like the last little topic that we'll get into. But I want to get into like the meme stock craze, because it seems like, that isn't over. We had GameStop, AMC at the beginning of, COVID years where everybody was kind of starting getting in. And now we've kind of recently had AMC with another resurgence. They did a new ticker with APE, and that stopped trading, I think, like the 11 times on the first day that it was available. And then people are kind of doing the same thing with Bed Bath & Beyond. So, I mean, on that note, we were talking about like how when we were just getting started, the things that we wouldn't find and figure out. But it seems like a lot of people that are getting started are just kind of like, YOLOing into a lot of these meme stocks. Like, do you think like that this, obviously, I don't think that this is a sign of like a healthy economy or healthy way of people getting in just to try to figure out how to, get rich quick, essentially. But I think that the underlying issue here is that a lot of people are just trying to find ways to get out of the US dollar, raise as much money as they can because they see the writing on the wall. So they just need, a quick influx of cash. So, I mean, do you kind of see it in a similar light, or do you see like people just more so like, I guess, gambling and just kind of having fun with it because they have too much time on their hands?
I don't think it's a product of too much time. I agree with more or less everything you said there. I'll add some color where I think I can, where I think I can. With stuff like AMC and stuff like, this Ape token or Bed Bath Beyond or GameStop a year ago, what I see is twofold, right? There's the guys who have too much time on their hands. Everyone was playing with those COVID checks, which, by the way, like, talk about an incredible failure. There's just no attempt to even earmark that money for groceries or rent by a huge chunk of the population, thanks to, Davey Day Trader et al. On Twitter, just banging stuff out every day, right? So that's one issue. But I think more broadly, if I can, I'll tie it back to Bitcoin a little bit. And I think Bitcoiners, for the most part, are smart people who just don't see another way to grow their wealth through traditional means. They don't have money to employ a money manager. They don't have the capital to buy rental properties or what have you. There's many different ways that people with money grow their wealth, and not many ways people without money can become wealthy. And so what we're seeing now is these sort of low entry barrier vehicles, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's AMC, GameStop, ApeCoin, Dogecoin, you name it, right? People just looking to take a moonshot because they see that not only is I don't think a lot of people know that the writing is on the wall for the US dollar, but I do think that a lot of people understand that their position in life is not going to change short of, what's probably damn near a miracle. So that's one thing about the meme stocks. Other thing about the meme stocks is, man, I think if you really want to go deep, like this is probably too much for today, but there's a psychological component to stuff like GameStop, AMC. And that psychological component is that there's a lack of community, generally speaking, in people's lives. I really believe that. And when you can embrace a community of people and you don't have, a close group of friends or a good family, or you're locked inside your house for 3 months because of COVID, the bar for what you consider community drops every single day until you find yourself pissing money away because some guy on Reddit posted a chart that you can't really read, but it has a lot of upvotes. And it's, the AMC trading view chart with rocket ships and diamonds all over it. And you're like, fuck it, I'm going all in. And there's another guy who says, fuck it, I'm going all in. And then before you know it, you're front page on CNBC for 2 weeks. And that kind of thing is caused by lack of community, lack of engagement in real life from people. And that's a bigger problem. I think it's a bigger problem when it comes to political siloing, economic siloing. And then, of course, you wind up with this kind of insanity, right? Like, look no further than, Jim Jones or Waco or whatever. Like, if you get too many people thinking the same thing for too long, you're going to find that you almost never get a good result. And thankfully, this time there wasn't a, firefight with the U.S. government, but rather just a bunch of good memes and probably a bunch of people who pissed away a lot of money. Like great example of government wasting their time and energy, right? They brought that Keith Kitty guy on or whatever. Remember, he was like, he had to testify in front of Congress. Like, that's banana. Yeah, that's banana republic shit, right? And so, is the GameStop meme thing over, buddy? Only until their interest rates go down. Then it's, you're right back on that. The first 50-point hike is going to indicate a pivot is at least in the works, and I think you're going to see things go gangbusters from there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, on that note, what is one last advice like you would give somebody like that is looking into getting into investing? They're seeing all these crazy things going on, whether it's, Bitcoin, shit coins, meme stocks, whatever. Like, what would be one advice that you would or one piece of advice that you would give somebody that's like, hey, I want to get started getting into investing? Like, what would be one thing that you would give them to give them like a little confidence? Obviously not financial advice, not financial advisors or anything like that, but give them a little bit of like, hey, like, all right, this is a smart idea opposed to like, all right, I'm just going to lose my money as soon as I put it in.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll give you two pieces of advice. One for when you're starting out and one for when you're making a decision. When you start, assume that you know nothing, and fees are not the worst thing in the world to pay for a robo-advisor. So in Canada, much like Acorns, Wealthsimple has a robo-advisor. I think it's actually free, but anyway, you can find ways to invest your money wisely. And also, I would just note that don't expect anything to happen for 6 months at a time, right? You might see a little bit of a jump day to day, but really what you're talking about for the first 6 months or a year, 18 months even, is your deposits, your consistency paying off as far as the balance goes. And for those 18 months, it's going to be slow grind, but set something up, forget about it, and go from there. Now, my second piece of advice, this is a piece of advice I give a lot of people for a lot of different things. And I don't know if I've said this to you before because you and me talk in a lot of different places, but before you make a decision about selling a stock or buying a stock based on something you saw on Twitter, before you make a decision about texting the girl you met at the club last night, before you make a decision about buying a pair of shoes, before you make a decision about, heading to Pornhub. My advice to you, okay, is get an egg and hard boil it and eat it. That's enough time for you to sit down and think about what you're about to do and decide whether or not it's a good idea. And on top of that, you add to your protein intake for the day, which is always a good idea. So start small, be consistent, and boil an egg.
There we go. Boil an egg. Joey, thanks so much for your time. Why don't you tell people where they can find you and what you got going on?
Canadian Bitcoiners Podcast. Me and my buddy Len hosted a couple times a week. You find it wherever you get your podcasts. I have been coming to Brandon's Tuesday Spaces to listen, his Friday Spaces to talk. And if you ever got any questions, hit me up on Twitter or tell Brandon what the questions are, and then I'll just ignore his messages.
Yeah, there we go. And CBP Media, you got to plug your other shows too, right?
Whatever. We got the Bear Cave. We just had Doomberg and Mike Green. I got one other guest in the cooker and one other one that I've asked for an introduction to. And we have another show that's also in the pipeline that I haven't talked about with anyone yet that we're excited to announce probably in the fall. So yeah, look out for that.
Yeah, there you go. CBP Media on the rise. All right, Joey, thanks so much.